Hello everyone, how are you doing? It's exactly 4 o'clock, so I think we're going to get started. So I'm Chabot, and I work at Twitter in the developer relations team. Now, in a conference like this, it's about the only place in the planet where people don't ask what's developer relations, so I'm going to skip that introduction. The thing that I will tell you is that as developers, we've known that mobile first is kind of a big thing now. We know that mobile only might even be a thing for some applications. But in many ways, I feel that we're at the cusp of the next big wave of innovation. We're at the beginning of something much bigger, much more interesting. And that's what I call the mobile future. So to share with you some of the things that we as developer advocates learn as we're at the forefront of technology and working with all these amazing startups and talking to our own customers as well. And I want to share some of the lessons from there and show you what the new patterns are that are starting to shape in this mobile ecosystem. So to do that, I'm going to start with giving you a bit of an overview of what transformative innovation is, like looking at history at where has this happened before in the past. Next, I'm going to take a look at where we see some of those patterns happening today. And then finally, we'll take a look at how we can use that in our own application and what some of these future patterns are going to be that you can use there. So as I said, I think we're at the beginning of transformative innovation. And to be able to understand what transformative innovation is, I personally look at some of the major events in history. And one of the major events that always inspired me incredibly is the venerable printing press, right? The printing press, as we know, has been responsible for free press, democracy, scientific method, banking, finance. In many ways, you could say it's the foundation of modern-day society. But it certainly didn't start out like that. When they made the printing press in the beginning, they were mostly just printing Bibles. Sometimes a book from a great philosopher, but mostly it was just Bibles. And it made sense, because when monks were writing books by hand, that was expensive and a long process, so you wouldn't spend that time on something frivolous, right? The printing press changed all of that. You suddenly were able to reproduce quickly and fastly and cheaply. It took 50 years, however, before something happened, where somebody said, well, if we can use the printing press to print the holiest of books, people are probably willing to pay for an erotic novel as well. And that's actually the first book that's a fictional story that was printed. The whole thing about novels and literature started with that very book. Now, as you can imagine, back in the day, people went like, what? The Pope said it was the end of civilization. People started burning books. It was a huge deal. But at some point, people got used to it, and fictional stories kind of became a thing, right? It took a whopping 150 years before something really magical happened with it, though. There's a group of people who call themselves the natural philosophers. The natural philosophers are basically what we would have called alchemists back in the day. And they said to move our science forward, we're not going to hold anything true unless it can be proven to be true. Because an alchemist would just write, hey, I've been able to create gold, right? He doesn't write down how you reproduce it. So they said, we're going to do something new. We're going to write down each and every step of our experimentation. We're going to collect that from all the natural philosophers and put it in a journal. Then we're going to use the printing press to replicate this journal at scale and at volume and send it to everyone else in the community so they can verify the results. Now, the reason why they did that is because, well, as you know, we're bad at criticizing ourselves. That's not what we're good at as human beings, right? We have an awesome talent, though. We're excellent at criticizing others. So they figured if we get other people to verify our work, then there's a pretty good chance that we'll hold up. Now, that was the foundation of scientific method. Everything that we're using today is based by these people taking that step and creating science, basically. And I think that's the shape of transformative innovation, because it's not the technology itself that's the most interesting thing. It's the new culture and behavior and the new things that it makes possible that really is the thing that changes society at a massive scale. And of course, if we look at something a little bit closer to our own day, the internet, we see the same pattern of innovation, right? Like one of the moments that really drove that home for me was in 2008. There was a situation in South Korea where they blocked the import of US beef. There was the whole mad cow disease situation going on back in the day, right? And they said, well, hey, we've gone through our trade negotiations. We've got a great deal in place with America. We're going to open up the borders again and allow US beef to come in. Now, that this was met by protest is not necessarily shocking. That often happens in these kind of political situations. The thing that is really shocking, though, was who was doing the protesting. Because it was teenage girls. Now, when you think about political change, you don't necessarily think teenage girls, right? So that was pretty surprising. And what happened was that there was this group of teenage girls who were hanging out on the website and the forums of their favorite boy band. You know how it is. And they were talking about all the stuff that teenage girls talk about, but they also shared, like, we don't agree with the fact that nobody asked the people of South Korea if they agree with exposing ourselves to this health risk. They got so upset that they said, we're going to go out this weekend and we're going to hold a public candlelight protest. We're going to go to all the public town squares with the candles, and we're going to show how displeased we are that nobody heard our voice. So that's exactly what happened. There's this massive army of teenage girls flooding the streets of all the major cities. Now, you can imagine the government looked at this and they went, we have no idea what to do about this. Like, this is an entirely new situation, and there's no playbook that tells you how to deal with this. So first they waited a little while. They didn't go away. So they did what governments always do in this situation. They sent in the riot police. So you've got riot police, full body armor, batons, water cannons, attacking this group of teenage girls. What they didn't count on, however, is that teenage girls are also very technologically savvy. So they took out their smartphones, they took photos, they took videos, and they uploaded it to the internet. Now, we all live on the internet, I think, so you can imagine what happened next. The reaction to it was instantaneous, voluminous, and full of outrage. Like, people freaked out, and it turned into a major international scandal. Like, nobody wants to see riot police beating down on teenage girls, right? It turned into such a scandal that the government was forced to resign because of it. Now, that's the first time that something like that happens, and the internet being there and allowing groups to self-organize at this scale without being an official organization, that is entirely new, and it's changed the very foundation of how we run this world, how politics work, what our expectations are of our governments as well. Now, working for Twitter, we're lucky enough that we get to see a lot of these kind of situations. Twitter is often one of the tools that gets used whenever something big happens. Spring revolutions in Turkey, World Cup, all those kind of situations. But it's definitely changed things at a fundamental level. And I think that's the interesting type of innovation that really inspires me to say, well, that's why I'm in technology, to build those kind of solutions. So I think with that, we've got a good understanding of what this kind of innovation looks like. And I want to take a step to seeing where this is going in our current life. And one of the things that makes this mobile future so interesting to me is that a mobile phone is an essentially different device from a personal computer. In fact, I think personal computer wasn't even the best name for that device. There's 1.5 billion of them, but the vast majority of them are either at the office, they're shared with a family, they're not very personal. Us in the room might be the exception to that, but for most people, it's a shared experience. They also don't take them with them everywhere. They stay in their office or in their home. So in many ways, they're shared devices, not personal devices, but mobile phones, on the other hand, those are essentially different platforms. Like, I wouldn't go anywhere without my mobile phone in my pocket. Heck, these days, you can't even go to the bathroom without your mobile phone anymore, right? It's like, oh, I gotta go. Where's my phone? That's kind of the steps that we take now. So that's a very different situation, very personal device. The other thing that's also essentially different about it is that there's just so bloody many of them. We know there's 1.5 billion personal computers. There's more than 1.5 billion smartphones already, and that's going to grow to about 4 or 5 billion in 2017. Now that means, beyond that, there's all these cliche jokes that there's going to be more smartphones than toothbrushes, which is partially true. But I think the really large, tremendous impact of this is going to be is that the internet is going to double or triple in size. And whenever new media takes these giant leaps forward, interesting things tend to happen. Like if you look at the internet itself, it absorbs things like newspaper, listening to music, watching movies. All these things have been sucked into this new, better platform. So as the internet is going to double and triple in size, I suspect we're going to see many more of those kind of huge changes. And in fact, I think we can already see a couple of those changes when we look at the fringes of society. I mean, one of the hard lessons in life is that necessity is the mother of innovation, right? If you're generally happy in life, you sit on your couch, you watch television, you play Flappy Bird, you're not really innovating. But on the other hand, if you live in Africa, and you've got serious problems like hardly any existing infrastructure. Less than 25% of the people in sub-Saharan Africa have a bank account. There's no access to electricity for vast amounts of time. Now, there's all these kind of real challenges in their lives, and that means that they're innovating to work around those challenges as well. So we see some really interesting stuff happening there. And one of the things that really blows me away is M-Pesa. Now, M-Pesa is a payment system that uses feature phones. Now, for a lot of people in the room, we might look at this and we go, like, those are pretty old-fashioned phones. That's pretty low-tech, right? But if you think about it, a smartphone barely lasts for a conference. So if you don't have enough electricity, having a feature phone that will last for many days is actually a pretty damn good thing to have. So they build a payment system using text messages. And you can send money to other people using their phone numbers, you can notifications when you get your payments, you can check your balance with text messages, and you can put more money into the system with your prepaid account as well. Now, for a country where doing commerce and payments was that hard, this was a big deal. And it's such a big deal that it's been growing tremendously over the years, and already 43% of the entire GDP of Kenya is now flowing through this system. So this is becoming the essential infrastructure for payments in this region. I think that's a really interesting use case of technology where we can really see like culture and habits and new possibilities being shaped around it. I think another key takeaway here is that it's a societal change that's really interesting and not necessarily the technological platform itself. We can see another example of that kind of innovation when we look at China. Now, I know that for a lot of people who grew up in the 80s and the 90s, they think of China as the factory of the world. That's where stuff gets built and it gets shipped to the West, and that's just how things are, right? In many ways, that's not doing justice to the situation where we are today, because even if they started out like that, they're innovating at tremendous scales now, and they're doing stuff that just blows me away. And the reason for that is, you know, they've got a society that's growing at such a scale, they need to come up with new solutions. Like they're in a situation where there's 14 cities with over 5 million people in them. There's 41 cities with over 2 million people in them. There's 80,000 people joining the middle class each and every day, all year through. So that means that there's so many new people that want to buy cool stuff and do cool stuff that, well, you would want to build infrastructure for them, but it's prohibitively expensive. You just cannot open enough stores quickly enough to service all these people so they can go shopping. So that's a big problem, right? So what they do instead is that they use their smartphones and their laptops to shop online. The interesting thing for me is that this isn't even e-commerce to them. This is just commerce. It's the only way you can buy a refrigerator or a phone or any of those other kind of devices. So that's a completely different way from how we perceive shopping, right? The impact of that is tremendous. One of the stories that I really love is Chabot, and that's kind of the Amazon/marketplace of the region, much larger scale. And Chabot, being very clever at marketing, they said, we're going to organize Singles Day. And Singles Day is the opposite of Valentine's Day. Instead of celebrating that you've got a partner, we're going to celebrate being single. Now, how do you celebrate being single? You buy a present for yourself, right? I see some recognition in the audience. We all know how it works. So they said on Singles Day, we're going to give everyone 50% off if you buy a present for your single friend or for yourself. They sold $5 billion in that day. $5 billion off an e-commerce website in one day. That's tremendous. We see the same kind of thing when we look at Alipay. Now, Alipay is kind of the PayPal of the region. Again, I would make the argument that they're probably more advanced because they've solved problems we haven't even started thinking of. Like PayPal does $180 billion a year. Now Alipay, which powers payments on Chabot, WeChat, you can't even get a taxi without using WeChat anymore. They don't accept cash. It's just scanning QR codes on a mobile phone. That's how you do your payments. So that's become so popular. They did $1.6 trillion in 2013. $1.6 trillion. That blows away anything we've seen before. Scale of that is just massive. And that's why I think that's kind of cool. That's a really nice preview of where we're going in the future. Things are going to be sucked into it like crazy. The other thing that I think is really interesting, especially for us as developers, is that because it's such an essentially different device, the rules of the game have been changed as well. Like when I grew up on the internet, the way that you build a website with users on it was that you build a page with a registration form. And we came from the time where there was like contracts and stuff. So we thought it was a great idea to have a registration form that said what's your first name, what's your last name, what's your street address, what's your zip code, what's your country, what's your phone number. And there's this massive form of information you had to fill in before you were able to get into a system. Now, as you can imagine, 90% of the people never completed that process because that was kind of painful. So they came up with a better solution. They said, instead of requiring you to fill out that major form, we'll use a social login. It's one button, and now we understand who you are as a person. Going to make things a lot easier, and it vastly improved the amount of customers that didn't complete the sign-up process. But the downside was, of course, that if you wanted to have an identity and knowing who they were connected with and being able to share cool moments or artworks or anything else that you wanted to share out, you were committed to one social platform. And that social platform owned a relationship with your end users. Now that's an interesting relationship, and even though it's kind of worked for a long time, I wouldn't call it the best possible outcome. That's why I'm super excited that the rules of that game are changing tremendously. Instead of having a registration form or a Facebook or a Twitter or MySpace or whatever kind of button, people have started using phone numbers. And it makes sense because if there's one stable identifier for me as a person, it's probably my phone number, right? That's what all my friends have there in contact list. That's what I give to other people and then reach out to me. So when you use a social application where you want to connect with people, why not use phone numbers? So the pattern here is pretty easy. Whenever people open up a registration page, it's just like, hey, what's your number? The moment you fill that in, you get a text message with a code, so we verify that you really are the owner of this, and now we have a stable identity relationship. The way that it changed the game, however, is that because we're no longer locked into one person owning our relationship with our end user, is that people can now move around between applications. And when WhatsApp was down a couple months ago, for a few hours in a day, we definitely saw that behavior. Like, a lot of people use WhatsApp, right? It's a pretty cool application. But they were down, so everyone said, well, let's download Telegram. And you could just register with the same phone number, you can send a link to your friends, and you can just keep on chatting using a new application with no interruption in service at all. So that's definitely changed the rules of the game. That means the competitive landscape is now much more open than it's ever been before. And we see that in other ways as well, like the social graph. Just get a contact list. Those are the people that I'm talking to, those are the people I'm connected to, those are the people that I care about. Likewise, having access to all the users' photos was never possible in an application, right? Like, they have to upload them to the website each and every time again that you were doing a new application. But nowadays, when you're on a mobile device, everyone has access to the same photo library. Same is true for calendars, task management, all this other contextual information about our lives. So that's a fundamental change on how we do applications. Another big change is that because these devices are so personal and always with us, they know much more about us as well. Like, a phone will probably know about the weather around you. It will know about air quality, light intensity levels, audio levels. It will know about your management of tasks. It knows about your short-term and long-term goals. It knows about your calendar. It knows who you are, who you're interacting with. Probably you can do a good guess on what their standing relationship is between people. So that means that you can take that raw information and start offering people services instead of just raw data. And I think that's a really big trend of where we're going with these devices as well. And one of the examples that really amazed me was back in the day when I was working at Google. This was before Google Now was released, and I saw somebody's phone ringing in a meeting, and it said, hey, if you want to make your flight, you better leave now to the airport. Because it looked at the calendar, and it saw that there was a flight in there. It looked at the current location, and it looked at where the airport was, and it saw was there a lot of traffic. So Google Now said, hey, you better leave now because there's a lot of traffic, and otherwise you're going to miss your flight. Now, that's pretty normal now. We've gotten used to this. But the first time you see this, you go, whoa, wait a minute. You're actually taking raw information and doing stuff that's super useful in my life. That's pretty magical. Those are cool moments. Another example that inspires me tremendously is something that Twitter collaborated on called Data Miner. And what it does, well, we've got a little video actually. What it does is it looks at tweets as they're happening and it tries to find patterns in there. And the moment it sees a tweet with an interesting keyword and other tweets with the same keywords, it says like, wait a minute, there's actually something happening. And it sends an alert to the CNN news desk. Now, the thing that they found is that this system is an average, I think, 15 to 18 minutes faster in reporting major international events than actually using live reporters on the ground. So this is tremendous. This is such a big deal where using contextual information, going from raw data to actionable advice, that's something we've never been able to do before. We just didn't have the right information. We didn't have the right compute power. That's going to be a big deal. The other thing is, there's this concept in biology called a Cambrian Moment. I don't know if anyone's familiar with that term. I'm seeing 2 or 3 hands, so I'll explain it. The Cambrian Moment is, there's this long period of life on Earth where there's only a couple of life forms and they were not very successful at all. And then suddenly there was this explosion where millions of new life forms were being created. And that's the Cambrian Moment. And the reason why that happened is because life figured out the basic building blocks. Cell membranes, DNA, replication, how to get energy out of your ecosystem. Once those basic building blocks were figured out, life could start experimenting. And I think that developer ecosystem is going through the same kind of thing. Like back in the day, you would have to buy a computer, lease a line, plug it in, get system administrators, and you would spend $100,000 on hosting a simple website. Developer tools were arcane as well. We were coding in VI. There was no debuggers built in. You would use GDP on a command line. All those things have been figured out to the point now where we can be so much more productive and get stuff done so much cheaper and so much faster that we're seeing millions of new applications being developed that otherwise would have been prohibitively expensive to build. Now, with that being said, we're not done yet. As we're moving into these new ecosystems, there are a lot of new problems that are arising. At Twitter, we're lucky enough that we have a pretty cool application that's like the top in a lot of app stores in a lot of countries. That means we get to feel a lot of the pains that developers are feeling as well. So one of the tools that we acquired a bit over a year ago is called Crashlytics. So the problem that I'm sure you're all familiar with is you're building a mobile application, you test it on the 2 or 3 phones that you have. If you're lucky, you've got an iOS device and you've got a couple of Android phones, but there's a limit on how much testing you can do, right? But then when somebody has a phone that you haven't tested it on, or they're in a different market, network, localization, their application might crash. And if their application crashes, they're going to go to the App Store or Google Play Store, and they're going to leave a gnarly review saying, I did not like this application at all. And before you know it, you've got less than 4 stars rating, and that means your application is kind of failing out there. So being able to guarantee that your application is actually up and running and stable is a huge deal in being successful in the market. So Crashlytics is the tool that solves that. You can use it on iOS, Android, other platforms as well. And as your application is crashing, it will send live reports that you can see in real time as the crashes are happening. It will also tell you how many crashes are happening, and it will group them based on the type of bug and the type of place in the source code. So you can say 100 out of my 200 crashes are all because of this one bug. That's the thing that I need to fix first. So it will show you how many crashes you've got. It will actually show you the source code line that it's happening in, give you the precise breakdown, like the average free space, RAM, what kind of network to connect it to, etc. Will give you actionable insights in being able to figure out what happened on that line of source code. Give you beautiful breakdown on all the environment around these kind of crashes as well. So using that, you can solve a really big problem. The other problem that we've taken on to solve is beta testing. Now, when you work for a large company, you take beta testing for granted, right? Like, that's what you do. But as a slightly less sizable company, those things are kind of tricky because there's UUIDs, there's enterprise certificates if you're in iOS, there's how do you invite people to download stuff, and how do you track how they're using it and if there are any crashes coming out of it. So something that we released, I think it was a few weeks ago, is the beta program, and it will take care of all of this for you. You can say, this is my application, this is where it lives, and it will help you solve all the problems around certificates, UIDs, sending emails to invite people. And then actually you can see how much they're using it and if there's any crashes and problems that come up out of it. So if you want to do beta testing with a new version of your app, and you kind of should because it will help you to be much more successful, strongly encourage you to try this out. The other problem is, well, we all know that building a great app is important, but the other problem we have as developers making money off the app. So one of our bigger acquisitions, and something I'm super excited about, is Mopub. And Mopub is an automatic bidding system for ads. Now, I know we're getting way too cashy here for developer audience, so I'm going to skip over some of the details. But what it comes down to is that you can say, I want to have native advertising in my application. A lot of bigger applications use this. The revenue on this is much better than most of our competitors out there, partially because of the whole automatic bidding. It's the thing that made Google Ads really cool as well, and we do that on mobile. So that can help you solve the problem of how do you make money. The final problem you might have as a developer is, how do I tell people about my application? So what we have is what we call Twitter cards. And Twitter cards are basically these kind of cards in your timeline. And one of the cards we have is to promote your application. So you can promote tweets, people can reshare it, you can get people to tweet about it as well. Great way to get social exploration and discovery of your application. If you want to know more about any of these technologies, we do have a booth in the main auditorium. So please come talk to us and we can show you the exact code on how to implement any of this. So the final thing that I find really inspiring about these technological trends is that technology does not become interesting until it's actually technologically boring. And we see that with text messages in Kenya and all those other kind of systems. They're not the early adopter use cases, right? It's when the rest of society goes, wow, this is an amazing tool, that things get really interesting and it really drives change in society. So and I think that's where wearable technology is going to be a really big thing as well. Internet of Things, that whole realm of innovation, it's going to allow us not to be aware anymore of devices. Like if you look at Google Glass and Fitbit and all those kind of things, I'm excited about them as an early adopter. I've played with them, I've written code for it, but I don't think it's the final device yet. It's a prototype for the future. And I think the real future is going to be when we get to a point where we're not even aware of a plastic box in our hand anymore, but computing is just something that exists in our everyday life. So I wanted to end on a note of why I think this is such a big deal. As for a long time, as we've been living on the internet, you almost could get a sense that innovation was almost done. Every major product was invented, every major technology was figured out. But the great news is that it was really just a stepping stone to the next much bigger wave of innovation. And that's what we're seeing in this social space. We can definitely see some of the early trends there, payments being absorbed by it, commerce being absorbed by it, the way that people interact, do politics, form government, everything is changing because of this new platform. So the world really is wide open. We're at the beginning of this process. And if we jump in with both feet, we get to define exactly what that future looks like. So that's what I call living in a mobile future. So thank you so much for your time and attention. And since we have a few minutes left, I'd like to open it up to questions, comments. Who's got a question? No one at all. Seriously, don't be shy. Well, okay, we'll be in the auditorium, so come find me and I'd love to talk to you. Thank you.